Hello comrades, and welcome back to Ushanka Show, the channel dedicated to the stories about life in the USSR. If you're new to my channel, my name is Sergey, and back in July of 1971 I was born in Kiev, the capital of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainskaya Sovetskaya Социалистическая Республика. In today's video we're going to talk about the difference of being Ukrainian and Russian, Soviet Ukrainian, and we're going to talk about Russification. I already touched this topic before, but from a different angle in my video called Relations between Russians and Ukrainians in the USSR in the 80s. Link will be below this video in the comment section. But let's begin with the question by Joseph Seckelman. Sergey, thank you for this great insight into the life in the Soviet Union. I have some questions. In the 30s, Stalin moved hundreds of thousands of ethnically Russians into Ukraine from Russia. Today, those Russian descendants are now millions of ethnically Russians. You are ethnically Russian, but we'll talk about it later. You grew up in Ukraine. Do you feel closer to Russia and Russians than Ukrainian and Ukrainians? Second question. During the 30s, due to some independence activities by nationalist Ukrainians, Stalin deliberately starved millions of Ukrainians in Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians feel angry about this today? An interesting comparison would be Ireland. Ireland was not an independent country until 1920s. One of the main grievances of the Irish was the British government's indifference to the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, where tens of thousands starved to death. This led to the Irish independence movement. Okay, comrades, so first things first, I'm not ethnically Russian. I'm 100% ethnically Ukrainian. Actually, correction, I'm 98% Ukrainian and 2% Jewish, according to my DNA test results that I did here in America. My father, Nikolai, or as we say in Ukrainian, Mykola, is Ukrainian from Zhytomyr region, and my mother, Yelena, or as we say in Ukrainian, Olena, is an Ukrainian from the northern part of Ukraine, from Chernigov region. But while I'm ethnically Ukrainian, by my upbringing, I am a Soviet Ukrainian. And there's a big difference between like modern day Ukrainian person and Soviet days Ukrainian person. Although I grew up in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, while at that time as Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, because of the education situation in those days Ukraine, I grew up speaking Russian. So my first language is Russian, and only my second language is Ukrainian. This predicament when a Ukrainian person speaks mostly Russian is even worse right now for me, because after 20 years I lived in the United States. My first language, I guess, still Russian. My second one is English, and only a third language is Ukrainian. If I try to speak Ukrainian to you right now, I'll be constantly stopping, pausing, and using Russian or English words if I couldn't find in my head a proper Ukrainian word. I'm a real mess. So if I try to answer the question, did I feel closer to Russia and Russians? The answer, of course, is no, but I didn't feel closer to Ukrainians. Back in those days, I actually considered myself Soviet of Ukrainian nationality. So if somebody will ask me if I'll travel abroad, of course it was nearly impossible, I would tell them I'm a Soviet person, not Ukrainian or Russian. And I believe I mentioned this story several times before, but when the hockey team of the Soviet Union went to play in the United States or Canada, and I heard local commentators saying Russian team, I was actually getting mad because those guys weren't Russians. They were Soviets, first of all. And it's like because there were teams from different hockey teams of Soviet Union, some Ukrainians, some Russians. So for me, they were all Soviets. Now, as we come to the statement about 1930s and Stalin moving hundreds of thousands of ethnically Russians into Ukraine, this forced migration happened predominantly in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbas region, when Stalin needed a lot of workers to build coal mines and do the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union. So that's where a lot of Russians moved in. Back in the 80s in Kiev, around all my friends and school friends, probably about 20% Russians, the rest were Ukrainians. Quite a few of these Russians, and I don't know the numbers, were actually criminals. They were brought into the labor camps in Donbas region to build coal mines, and after they were done with their term, they were free, but they just settled down. So historically, the eastern part of Ukraine always had high rates of crime all the way into 80s and 90s. There was like towns were dangerous, pretty much similar to what you can call ghetto here in the United States. There was just these workers areas where the youth was aggressive, like Gopniki. You can get robbed, you can beat up, you can get raped. A classic example of a Russian person from eastern Ukraine, guess who? Viktor Yanukovych, our former president of Ukraine. His father, Fyodor, came from the Vitebsk region, Russia, where he lived in a small village, was a peasant, and he came to Donbas region and became a machinist of the steam locomotive train. So Viktor Yanukovych, our future president, grew up in quite a rough workers' neighborhood in Donbas. He became a petty criminal in his youth. He actually went to prison twice. He served in a penal colony. I don't recall exactly. Once was for stealing, another time for beating somebody up really bad, so like hooligan, and still he managed to become the president of Ukraine. If you're interested to learn more about presidents of the newly independent Ukraine, I also have a video about it, and the link will be in the comment sections below. Okay, let's move along and back to the comment and to the second question. And the second question was, during the 30s, due to some independence activities by nationalist Ukrainians, Stalin deliberately starved millions of Ukrainians in Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians feel angry about this today? Well, first of all, and it's my personal opinion, I don't think in the 1930s there was much going on regards the independence activities by the nationalist Ukrainians. According to Vladimir Putin, the greatest historian of modern times, Ukraine was created in 1922 by Vladimir Lenin. So the creation of Soviet Ukraine went like this. Red Army managed to occupy Donbas and some other parts of eastern Ukraine, including Kharkiv, where they announced the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic with capital in Kharkov. Meanwhile, in Kiev, there was another Ukrainian government of Ukrainian People's Republic, which was created in 1919 after announcing its independence from Russia. And of course, the Soviet government in Moscow couldn't just allow the most of Ukraine, including Kiev, be under control of Ukrainian Nazis, so they started the bloody special military operation in Ukraine, and they end up taking over Kiev and central Ukraine, and then moved the capital from Kharkiv to Kiev in 1934. Sounds familiar, right? So going back to the second question, I don't think Stalin starved millions of Ukrainians because of their independence activities by nationalist Ukrainians. I think he did that because Ukrainian peasants refused to join collective farms. They refused to be part of collectivization. And once again, it's my personal opinion, and I know quite a few people will be angry with me, but I don't think that Stalin was deliberately starving Ukrainian peasants. He was just confiscating grain because he needed money to do his industrialization, and since he couldn't get a credit from the American banks, he had to pay cash for all the equipment, for the factories, for Stalingrad tractor factory, Kharkov tractor factory, all those places, Magnitka. He needed money, and the only way he could get cash, hard currency, was to sell grain at the discount to the West. And you probably know that Ukrainians weren't the only people that starved and died in large numbers during those days. A lot of millions of Kazakhstani people died from hunger, as well as Russians. But of course, there is no doubt that Stalin found starvation and hunger as a convenient tool to oppress any resistance. Okay, and also I would like to talk to you about Russification, Russificaция. So that's the process of the Russian government and later Soviet government of turning other mostly Slavic nations like Ukrainians or Belarusians into Russians by slowly robbing them of their own languages and forcefully or gently pushing the Russian language as the main language. So I'm gonna give you the list and dates of different laws that were introduced in order to fight the Ukrainian language. 1690. РПЦ, Русская Православная Церковь, Russian Orthodox Church, outlawed, so it placed anathema, it outlawed any church books to be published in Ukrainian language. So that's going back to 1690. 1720, so it's 30 years later, Peter the Great banned printing books in Ukrainian language in Kiev and Chernigov, two large Ukrainian cities. 1764, Catherine the Great signed the instructions on обрусение. So this обрусение is the word for Russification of Ukraine, Smolensk region of Russia. I guess they didn't have enough Russians going on there. Baltic states and Finland. So there were instructions how to Russificate those areas. 1888, Alexander III banned using Ukrainian language at any government offices in Ukraine, as well as using Ukrainian language during baptizing or giving any Ukrainian first names. 1914, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, banned publishing any newspapers in Ukrainian language. 1958, so that's shortly after the death of Iosif Stalin, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Soviet Union issued instructions of transferring Ukrainian schools into teaching in Russian language. Переход на русский язык. So this is how the 1980s you could hardly find any Ukrainian language schools in the capital of Ukraine. 1961, Communist Party of the Soviet Union introduced a new program about mixing the nations into a single Soviet nation. Единый Советский народ. 1983, so that's during my days, I was already 12 by then. Once again, Communist Party of the Soviet Union wanted to improve teaching Russian language in the Ukrainian schools and offered 15% bonus pay to any teacher that switched teaching his subject from Ukrainian to Russian language. And unfortunately, this trend continues to this day. I mean, you probably heard a statement by Vladimir Putin that Ukraine is artificial country and Ukrainian language is artificial language, although the Russians were fighting Ukrainian language going all the way back to 1690. So over 350 years, there's this battle against Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. So going back to your question, do the Ukrainians feel angry about this today? Well, it's definitely got way worse after Russia attacked Ukraine in February of 2022. But we didn't know all this information for years. Like Holodomor, collectivization, there's millions of hunger deaths. It was like top secret information during the Soviet days, so no one knew about it. It became public only during perestroika and glasnost. And you all probably heard about genocide. It's when there is a crime specifically against specific nation. But there's another interesting term called lingocide, lingocide. That's when you change the language to make it more, I won't say compatible, but more similar to the other language. That's what was going on. There were quite a few words in Ukrainian language that were replaced to make with the different words that sound more Russian. For example, the word pancernik was replaced with bronyovyk, so that's like the armed vehicle. Vantazhivka was replaced with грузовик. In Russian, it's gruzovik, so that's the lorry truck, dump truck. And there's many examples like that. Well, my friends, if you made it to the end of this long and boring video, thank you so much for your patience. Don't forget to like this video, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.
Потому что если дороги будут, то по ним неприятель проедет и прямо в сердце России попадет.
Я с ними согласен абсолютно.